Thank you, Sister Cameron. I think your dad was more nervous than you. If you guys were always curious to know what it sounds like to have an accent to sing in Spanish, you heard it right now. um, I was telling my wife we would sing the song all the time in Haral, and it's just amazing to see. Um, a lot of the people knew it there. It's such a powerful song, especially for, imagine for people who are raised in the countryside, tough life, poor life. Um, and it just lifts up your spirit to know that God will send the rain, especially on a people who are dependent on the rain for their crops. And Haral is a big agricultural center in the entire state of Guanajuato as well. So it brought back a lot of memories. I hope we will be able to go there sometime soon. The violence has subsided some. Um, I spoke with Pastor Efren earlier in the month, and he was there at the beginning of this month. They had a wedding, a baby dedication, and I think 2 or 3 water baptisms. The church there right now, he told me, is about 50 people. They're meeting in Victoria. They have like a permanent place now where they meet, not in somebody's house anymore because it's a little too much. The Lord is just doing amazing things. So um, Luis afforded me kind of that entryway here and to at least bring an update on Mexico. Well, today is Father's Day, and Angie was surprised that I didn't have my computer with me, and I'll let you guys know why. Because I titled this message Fatherhood, Avoid These Dangerous Mistakes. So I'll be talking about mistakes from my own life as a father, and I don't need any notes for that. And I'm sure as fathers here, we all have made mistakes. I'll just talk about 2 of them. And we're going to be using another father in Scripture. His name was Eli. And we'll look at the mistakes that he made. And when we read about Eli, we are tempted to think, oh boy, a horrible father. How could he? He's a high priest. And yet it could happen to any one of us fathers. We are tempted to think that maybe we'll do a better job. And we're not going to fall into the things that, our fathers did. And we might have these pet peeves of what our parents did with us. We're going to say, no, I'm never going to do that with my kids. And maybe to a certain degree, we improve upon some aspects of what we learn from our fathers. But we have our other weaknesses that maybe our parents didn't. Um, and so our children will look at us, and they're very good at detecting those weaknesses and bringing them out. So before I do that and we enter straight into the message, I do want to wish everybody a happy Father's Day. Um, I'm sure we all have different memories that maybe resonate with some of these pictures, right? Going to the snow, that was always a fun time for us growing up, at least in Romania. When we were young here in America, we didn't really have that opportunity unless we were taking a road trip up to Portland, and then we would see the snow. Um, Otherwise, we just look at the mountains up here. Fishing, I had a lot of memories of going fishing. My dad did not like fishing, but he loved to eat fish. And so we would catch them and he would fry them. Um, um, I'm sure that people have wonderful memories of being on their father's shoulders, especially little girls, right? Um, but whatever our memories might be, one thing that I've realized is that as we grow older in life and we mature, we tend to really remember and dwell upon those great memories. We forget the spankings, we forget the major harsh disciplines. We forget all of that. Not that we forget in terms of we can't remember, but what sticks at the forefront. Um, and when we get nostalgic and we start just going down memory lane, we always seem to remember the goodness of our fathers. And this is what happened with a lady as well. Father's Day started because of a mom. And it actually started on a Mother's Day. Miss Sonora Dodd in Spokane, Washington, happened to be at a Mother's Day service. She was part of a Methodist church. And while she listened to the Mother's Day message, she said, why don't we have a similar thing for Father's Day? And the reason why was because her father, there in the picture, he was a Civil War veteran whose wife died shortly after the war, and he ended up raising 6 children on his own. And so you can imagine the kind of feelings and the kind of memories Sonora would have when she would think about her dad. And so she decided to honor him by going to the mayor of Spokane and asking if, at least within the city, they could start doing something to commemorate the fathers. And they did. They did so the following year in 1910. And from there on out, she started to petition some of the House of Representatives and senators that were representing Washington back to Washington, D.C., the state of Washington. And slowly, the message started getting to higher and higher levels to where in the 60s, President Lyndon B. Johnson had declared the third Sunday of June as Father's Day, and finally President Richard Nixon signed it into official law in 1972, and so that's how we have Father's Day. Fathers have such an important role, and I hope you guys can see a lot of those statistics on here. You know, 1 out of 4 children in America, 19.7 million children in America, live in a home without a dad, meaning either a biological dad, a stepdad, or even an adoptive dad. That's 20 million children, 25% out of the 100 million children in America. There is a huge, huge, huge problem that we are facing. When you look at 1 out of every 4, these kids carry a weight around them that takes years, and it takes the gospel of Jesus Christ to be able to restore the brokenness as a result of this. You see, unfortunately, the statistics are very sad for these children because these children are at 4 times greater risk to live in poverty, not just as children, but for the rest of their lives. For girls, they are 7 times more likely to become pregnant while they're teens before they even know much about life and make a solid commitment in marriage to one man. They are 2 times more likely to suffer obesity. They are more than likely to go to prison, to commit a crime, to drop out of high school. And the list can go on and on and on. The presence of a father in a home is so important. But how about for us? You might say, well, we are present fathers. And as we look at Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 2, he was a present father. He was there physically. His children were always around him, and even into their old age, because where we pick up with this story, we're already deducing, because his sons were serving in the temple, that they were of an adult age. They weren't the age of Samuel, who was just kind of a helper there to Eli. So let us turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2, and let's look at 2 things, 2 mistakes that I as a father and that we as fathers make, and that I'd like to dwell upon a little bit here for the next 10 minutes, and to really try to avoid these things because they create so much disaster in our families. 1 Samuel chapter 2, we'll start off from verse 12. We'll read just a short passage for now, verse 12 through 17, and it says this. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged fleshed hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take it for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give me meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." And if the man said to him, "They should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires," he would then answer him, "No, but you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Therefore, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. The first thing that we see as a big mistake that fathers can make, present fathers can make, is to be passive. To be passive. Eli, as a high priest, who is kind of like the CEO of the temple, who had to know everything that moved, everyone that served, the rotations, and everything that happened. Here is Eli the high priest seeing in front of his own eyes, under his own nose, what's going on. And yet, this stuff happened over and over and over. And two things we read here in verse 12 and verse 17 that really caught my eye. The first was that Hophni and Phinehas did not know the Lord. Verse 12. As fathers, we think we could be present physically, but our passivity, if we do not actively engage with our children, our Christianity will not just rub off on them. They will see and they'll experience just a cultural Christianity in us. They will not see the personal relationship that we have with God. And as fathers, it is our responsibility to teach our children how that is done. How do you live a life and emulate a life that shows this unique relationship between us and our Father in heaven? Eli was such a passive father that right from the beginning, the very first verse that introduces us to his two children, to his two sons, it states right up front, they did not know the Lord. They were going through the motions. They were serving because genetically they were part of the tribe of Levi. They were part of the holy priesthood lineage of Aaron. And so that's why Eli was the high priest, and the priesthood was now going to follow just because of DNA. That's how the Lord had ordained it, through Aaron and through a specific son of Aaron. And they thought, hey, we got our job set. Our dad's the preacher in town. We're going to be the next preacher, and we're going to have a good salary from the church. And no, this is not how Christianity works. This is not how your relationship with God works. And God warns us about this. And in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, Peter says, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Now, it's not just one specific lineage of Aaron that gets to be the high priest, but we all have the responsibilities as fathers to be the priests in our households. And we could be passive priests. We could be passive priests, and look what ends up happening. And not only is the consequence that your children not end up knowing the Lord, but look at what verse 17 says. Therefore, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord. that men abhorred the offering to the Lord. People did not want to come to worship God in the tabernacle that was around back then. This was before the temple was built. They wouldn't come to the house of the Lord because they're like, we're being abused by these priests. They're taking our sacrifice. They're taking our offering. I wanted to bring this to God, and they're eating of it. They're robbing us of our sacrifice. It's kind of like what happens today in the prosperity gospel, where preachers are preying upon people just so they can put more in the offering basket. You know what? God doesn't need any of our money. But God is teaching us a lesson in giving and in tithing. And if you ever are part of a church where you feel like that's happening, leave. And I pray this never happens in our church. Men abhorred to come to the house of God. And that stemmed from the passivity of Eli. The second lesson that we learn from Eli and from us and our mistakes is permissive. Eli was not just passive, but he was permissive. And check this out. Check this interaction between Eli and his son. Verse 22. Now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and how he lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father because the Lord desired to kill them. Hophni and Phinehas were so far gone, just like Pharaoh. Their hearts were hardened before God, and they had their mind set, this is going to be their lifestyle. And this is because of not just a passive father, but a permissive father. A permissive father is someone who allows things to happen and does not correct, does not discipline. And believe me, a lot of times I fall in this trap because I look at how many times I've disciplined my children over the last 24 hours, over the last week, over the last month, and I ask myself, am I being too harsh? Am I going too far? Am I raising my voice too quickly? And the Bible, as fathers, warns us in Colossians 3:21, and it says, fathers, don't provoke your children. There is a balancing act here as fathers, because we could be either permissive or we could either be provoking their anger. And that, you have to figure that out in your own relationship there, in your own family, where to strike that balance. Eli chose to stay on the permissive side. We read here in verse 22 where it says, now Eli was very old and he heard everything. Eli, you're too late. You waited until you're old? Not just you were old, but his kids were old. Very old here. He must have been at least in his 70s, I would deduce, because later on in chapter 4, at the end when he dies, he's in his 90s. And some time had passed between chapter 2 and chapter 4. So his children must have at least been in their 40s or even 50s. You might say, well, whoa, how? This is strange. This is something that's not really talked about in Western civilization, that fathers are fathers for the rest of their life, regardless of how old they are or how old their children are. Obviously, you interact with them differently. But as a father, You have the responsibility, regardless of age, to discipline your children. And yes, when they're 2, 3 years old, you discipline them one way as opposed to when they're in their preteens versus their teens versus their adult years. I remember my dad telling us the story that after he got married and after he had 2 kids, he talked back to his dad. And out of nowhere, his dad just whacked him. He slapped him in front of my mom. And he learned a very valuable lesson that day. I've never done that with my dad. I don't want to attempt to know what would happen, even if I have 4 kids. But in that culture, back in Romania, that was something that men, regardless of age, took it very seriously on how they interact with their children. And regardless of age, they still cared that their son, their daughter, would go on the right trajectory in life. And we see Eli, guys, it's not good. Instead of, no, not only is this not good, but I'm sorry, you're out. You're not going to serve in the temple anymore. Discipline them. Take them out of that responsibility. Do something. The house of the Lord is a sacred place. Why are you permitting something like this to happen? Fathers, our permissiveness is not helping our children, because to the 40s and 50s of these 2 sons, they reached the point where their hearts were so hardened that God said, it's over. Game over. I am not going to stand this anymore. Eli, if you didn't do something about it, I'm going to do something about it. And so this is a very important lesson here. And I want to draw a conclusion. The rest of this chapter, we have God sending an anonymous man of God, unnamed man. We don't know where he came from, who he was. But God sends this man of God to Eli, and he declares a very harsh word onto Eli and his family. And there's 2 things that we learn from these consequences. One, that the consequences for Eli and his sons were fatal. God came to proclaim judgment on them. They were going to die. And the sign for Eli was going to be that both of his sons would die at the same time on the same day. And not just that, but that the priesthood would be taken away from him and that it would be given to somebody else in the lineage of Aaron. Now, all of this happened. In chapter 4, we read that the Philistines come make war against the Israelites. The Israelite army gathers up. They said, whoa, what better idea than to go with the Ark of the Covenant? So the 2 priests, Hophni and Phinehas, went together with the Ark. They were the ones that carried it there. And on that day, Israel suffered a major defeat. Both of his sons die in that battle. They come. They bring the news to Eli. Eli falls backward and dies. After that, Samuel becomes the prophet in Israel. After that, Saul becomes king. After that, David becomes king. After that, Solomon becomes king. In the transition period of David's kingship to Solomon, something interesting happens. David gives a lot of direction to Solomon on how to deal with certain people. And one of those people was the high priest, Abiathar. Abiathar was the last and remnant of Eli who was serving in the priesthood. And they Solomon removed him from being the priest, and he gave it to Zadok. And from there on out, the priesthood went through the line of Zadok and the line of Eli, no more in royal priesthood. God is very serious when it comes to this. But I want to explore one more consequence that we see a little bit later on. And I haven't mentioned this young man, a young boy named Samuel, who grew up watching all of this, whose mom miraculously had him. She was barren. She couldn't have children. And she devoted Samuel from an early age to the temple. And so he never got to grow up around his biological dad and biological mom. And so what happened here? Samuel was heavily influenced by what he saw in Eli. And the second consequence, we see this, that the influence of Eli as a father figure to Samuel, unfortunately now translated to Samuel's children. We read it in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. It is so important to have a present father figure that is not passive, that is not permissive, but that actively teaches you how to be a man of God, how to be a royal priest under the new covenant. Because you cannot just have an influence on your own children, but you can have an influence on the children that are around you. And unfortunately, Samuel, even though should have made his own decisions, even though he's a mighty man of God, he failed miserably at fatherhood. And to me, it seems like that stems a lot from the only father figure he had around. And even though Samuel knew from the Lord, because in chapter 4, Samuel, in his first encounter with God, God told him what he was going to do to Eli, which was a confirmation of what the other man of God had spoken in chapter 2. And yet, for some reason, he fell into that same trap. I'm sorry if this is a very negative sermon, but it's a sermon of trying to awaken us up as fathers, that we have such a great responsibility. And if we do not take an active role in our children's lives and to be a good example even for the children that our children hang out with and their friends and the children in our neighborhoods, our influence will have them pay a major price. I thank God for my father. I don't know what it means to grow up outside of, that father and mother household. We've always had them around. They've always been faithful. They've always been steady. They've always been serving. And I know that I'm benefiting so greatly. And I know that I'm speaking to people who have had different experiences in life. But here's one thing that we can rest assured upon, even if we have had bad examples of fathers in our lives. We have the greatest example and role model in Jesus. And now we can look to him, and we know that he will help us. We know that whatever breakdown has been from one generation to the next, Jesus always comes to restore. Jesus always comes to heal. And so even if you didn't have a good father, or if you had no father at all, you can be a great father because you have Jesus on your side. So let us stand up in this closing prayer and let us ask the Lord to bless all the fathers here, to bless all the fathers in America, to bless all the children that do not have a father, and for the Lord to do something, a miracle through the church, to start, adopting those children, to start being a father to those children, to provide a father figure for those 20 million children that are suffering because they have no father. Amen.